Trump called it one of the worst halftime shows ever, and a slap in the face to America. That line hit the culture like gasoline on a fire, because it attached itself to something millions of people already felt long before the Super Bowl lights came on. Bad Bunny was never just a singer with a strange name and a global fan base. By the time he reached that halftime stage on February 8, 2026, at Levi's Stadium in Santa Clara, California, for the Apple Music Super Bowl LX halftime show, he had become something much harder to contain. A symbol of pride for some, but far more potently and divisively, a symbol of provocation, entitlement, cultural overreach, and open contempt for traditional American sensibilities for others. To growing numbers of critics, he represented a wider cultural shift that no longer even pretended to care whether ordinary Americans, those who still viewed the Super Bowl as a shared national ritual of football, commercials, and unifying spectacle, felt respected by the elites who dominate music, media, fashion, and sports. The performance, which featured elaborate sets evoking Puerto Rican sugar cane fields, jiberos in traditional straw hats, viejitos playing dominoes, piragua stands, and cameos from Lady Gaga, Ricky Martin, and Los Planeros de la Cresta, culminated in what some saw as a deliberate reframing of "God Bless America" into a broader, less nationally centered declaration that included Puerto Rico as if it were a sovereign entity, separate from U.S. sovereignty. That is why the backlash was so intense and immediate. It was not really about one 13-minute show. It was about accumulation years of swagger, years of politicized performances, years of crossing into core American institutions, and acting as if he had every right to bend them around his own grievances, identity, and language without offering even a minimal gesture of deference or inclusion for the broader audience. Years of being rewarded handsomely for confrontation. Years of critics feeling that every new commercial or critical success only made him more openly dismissive of the public expectations that older generations once believed came with stardom. A basic level of humility, accessibility, and respect for the platform that elevated you. The reaction unfolded in real time across social media, conservative outlets, and even rival programming. Turning Point USA quickly produced an alternative all-American halftime show featuring acts like Kid Rock, positioning it as a direct counter to what they and others viewed as an imposed cultural takeover. Trump's comments were blunt and unfiltered, describing the show as absolutely terrible, one of the worst, ever, an affront to the greatness of America, complaining that nobody understands a word this guy is saying, and calling the dancing disgusting. Some dismissed this as political theater from a master of grievance politics. But the reason it landed with such force is that it put blunt, unapologetic words to a broader sentiment already circulating well beyond Trump's core base. A lot of people, everyday viewers tuning in for football, not a lecture on identity or territorial status, felt the halftime show no longer even pretended to address or include them. They felt that one of the last remaining national rituals had been turned over to cultural elites who regarded ordinary patriotic sentiment as backward, English language centrality as oppressive or outdated, and the discomfort of traditional, often working or middle-class viewers as either irrelevant or morally deserved. Trump did not create that feeling of alienation. He exploited and articulated it. And Bad Bunny, by virtue of his long career choices, his refusal to assimilate or translate, and his history of explicit political positioning, had become the perfect, almost tailor-made object for that exploitation. He was too large to dismiss, too political to neutralize with polite applause, and too defiantly himself with his Spanish-dominant lyrics, his provocative fashion, and his aura of sovereign indifference to make any form of compromise or broad appeal gesture plausible. So the conflict escalated instantly from a mere taste dispute over beats and choreography into a full-blown symbolic struggle over who gets to stand at the center of American spectacle and define what America sounds like, looks like, and feels like in 2026. What makes this story more interesting and more unsettling than a simple right versus left outrage cycle is that both sides were responding to something undeniably real, even if their interpretations clashed violently. Supporters were not inventing the joy, pride, and sense of recognition the performance gave to many Latino viewers, especially those in communities navigating fears of raids, stigma, or cultural marginalization. The vibrant homage to Puerto Rican life, its rhythms, its everyday scenes, its history carried genuine emotional weight for them. But critics were not inventing the alienation either. The show really did foreground an identity politics and cultural frame that many English-speaking, non-Latino, traditionalist viewers experienced not as an invitation to shared celebration, but as a declaration of displacement. It felt less like a halftime show for all of America and more like a victory lap for one demographic's assertion of power on a stage that historically tried, however imperfectly, to unify. And Bad Bunny's prior public rhetoric, his endorsements, his ICE out comments, his responses to Trump-era remarks had already made those viewers deeply suspicious that this was never just about music or entertainment. It was about power, symbolism, territorial claims, language dominance, and the right to use giant American platforms as stages of resistance, grievance, and cultural redefinition rather than neutral, shared ritual. That underlying tension is the key to understanding why his entire biography became such a national argument rather than a straightforward success story. He is one of the first truly global stars of the streaming era to demonstrate, at repeated and massive scale, that you can use American institutions, American money, American audiences, and American stages without emotionally flattering, reassuring, or even acknowledging the broader American public's traditional expectations. That is historically significant in the evolution of fame and culture. It is also, from a certain perspective, rude, or at least it feels profoundly rude and disrespectful to those who still believe that using the center of American cultural power comes with some minimal obligation to respect its broadest audience, its history, and its shared symbols. If you look back across his life with a more critical eye, the pattern becomes hard to miss and harder to romanticize as pure underdog triumph. The church boy from Vega Baja becomes the SoundCloud striver, posting raw tracks from his bedroom. The striver becomes the anti-polish Latin trap star who deliberately cultivated a bored, insolent delivery that rejected mainstream polish. The trap star becomes the chart dominator who refused to translate himself into English norms or soften his edges for crossover comfort. The chart dominator becomes the political celebrity who spoke loudly for Puerto Rican anger, immigrant grievances, and direct criticism of U.S. institutions and figures like Trump. The political celebrity becomes the fashion insurgent who turned aesthetics nail polish, skirts, gender-fluid choices into ongoing arguments about masculinity and convention. The insurgent becomes the omnipresent global icon who seemed to insert himself into every arena from wrestling to awards shows to gossip cycles. The icon becomes the man who throws a fan's phone in a moment of irritation and then frames it as a principled stand for respect. The man who calls it respect becomes the artist who uses Grammy stages to denounce ICE and immigration enforcement in stark, moralizing terms. The artist who denounces federal agencies becomes the halftime headliner who takes America's biggest entertainment ritual and fills it with the very language, imagery, identity politics, and subtle territorial assertions that his critics had most feared and warned against for years. This was not a random collection of episodes or an organic evolution driven solely by authenticity. It was a deliberate, consistent escalation. Every time the world, the industry, or the audience seemed to expect him to broaden into a safer, more universally flattering superstar capable of true mass appeal, he instead became more pointed, more symbolic, more narrowly intense, and more likely to turn his own fame into a repeated test of whether the audience and the country would fully accept his terms or be labeled as intolerant for objecting. That is why he is so compelling even to people who actively dislike him and his output. He did not become diluted or softened by power and success. He became sharpened by it, hardened into a tool of cultural friction. And that sharpening is precisely what made him feel to many admirers like a bold hero of representation, and to many critics like a growing problem of entitlement and division. To understand the roots of this trajectory, one has to examine the early environment in far more granular detail than the standard Ragstarich's profile usually allows. Benito Antonio Martínez Ocasio was born on March 10, 1994, in Vega Baja, Puerto Rico, and raised in the Almirante Sur neighborhood, in what is often described as a lower-middle-class household. His father worked driving trucks, providing a steady but unflashy income, while his mother taught English, introducing an element of linguistic familiarity with the mainland United States from an early age. That background is repeated endlessly because it fits a neat cinematic template of humble origins fueling ambition. But the deeper reality is more contradictory and formative than inspiring in the conventional sense. Puerto Rico's status as an unincorporated U.S. territory creates a perpetual liminal space, citizens who can serve in the military and travel freely, but lack full voting representation in Congress, subject to federal laws without full say, economically dependent, yet culturally distinct, frequently romanticized or pitied, but rarely treated as seamlessly central to American identity. This split intimate with U.S. power structures, yet perpetually on the edge of full belonging, did not simply shape Bad Bunny. He internalized it and later weaponized it as both shield and spear. He grew up immersed in the sounds of everyday Puerto Rican life, reggaeton pulsing from cars and parties, salsa and merengue at family gatherings, the rhythmic bamba and plena traditions that would later surface more explicitly in his work. He participated in the local Catholic church choir until around age 13, an experience that provided early vocal training, but also a conventional moral framework. He would later contrast sharply against his public persona of rebellion and fluidity. He began making beats and freestyling at school, experimenting in private rather than seeking polished validation. He was never groomed to become a reassuring crossover product, designed to make the American mainstream feel comfortable or generous. Instead, he emerged from an environment where identity, irritation with external power, and a sense of frustrated entitlement already sat uncomfortably close together. That brew allowed him, years later, to project the energy of someone who felt no need to ask politely for entry into the cultural center. He did not sound like a supplicant seeking acceptance. He sounded like an outsider who had decided the most effective strategy was to force the center to notice, accommodate, and ultimately yield to him on his uncompromised terms. And once that approach proved commercially viable in the streaming era, the incentives aligned to push him further down that confrontational path, rather than toward any form of reconciliation or broadening. The mythology that surrounds pop stardom almost always sanitizes the messy realities of youth into comforting, marketable symbols. The church choir becomes a shorthand for innate humility and discipline. Working-class parents become proof of an unbreakable work ethic. A small town or barrio upbringing becomes pure authenticity, untainted by elite influence. In Bad Bunny's case, even the early chapters carried undertones that were less comforting and more predictive of the abrasive persona to come. He was not a naturally charismatic or polished public figure in the classic mold of earlier crossover stars. He carried a visible moodiness, a roughness around the edges, and an anti-charm that would later be reframed as magnetic realness, but often read as sullen entitlement. He studied audiovisual communications at the University of Puerto Rico's Arecibo campus, a practical choice that exposed him to media production tools he would later use to control his own narrative and visuals. At the same time, he bagged groceries at a local Econo supermarket, enduring the monotony of retail work while secretly building his music in his room and posting it online. That dual existence sounds like the ultimate scrappy underdog tale, and in a narrow sense it was. But the more telling detail is the persona he was crafting simultaneously, one that seemed engineered not around winning broad approval, but around resisting it, around turning personal discomfort and irritation into a core identity, rather than something to overcome. Even the origin of his stage name reveals this inversion. It stemmed from a childhood photo of him in a bunny costume, his face visibly annoyed and hostile, rather than cute or playful, the kind of awkward, unflattering image that most aspiring celebrities would delete or bury deep in family albums. Instead, Benito embraced it, wrapped the ridiculous, soft exterior of the bunny around a harder, more aggressive core, and turned the contradiction into branding. Cute costume paired with a hostile expression. Joke on the surface, defiance underneath. That was never incidental. It became the operating logic of his entire public machine. Softness as camouflage for stubbornness, unpredictability as strength, and a performative unwillingness to smooth out rough edges or perform gratitude for the audience or the industry. Most stars try to transform vulnerability into aspiration or relatability. Bad Bunny transformed discomfort, moodiness, and a baseline sense of being owed more into the foundation of his appeal. He did not market perfection or approachability. He marketed irritation, edge, and the thrill of watching someone refuse to conform. His breakthrough in 2016 with the track dials illustrates how the new algorithmic ecosystem rewarded this approach in ways the old gate-kept music industry might have tempered. The song spread rapidly on SoundCloud and YouTube while he was still working at the grocery store, leading to producer calls that pulled him out of retail drudgery almost overnight. This detail is romanticized as a fairy tale discovery moment, but it also highlights a crucial shift in cultural power. Bad Bunny did not have to navigate the slower, more paternalistic machinery of traditional American labels, managers, and A&R executives who historically spent years molding raw talent, smoothing accents, softening lyrics, teaching media training, and instilling a sense of obligation to the institutions granting access. He bypassed much of that. After linking up with manager Noah Assad, he leaned into a strategy of relentless singles, visually striking YouTube videos, and direct digital connection with fans rather than waiting for corporate validation. This independence meant he arrived on bigger stages with fewer internalized habits of deference, fewer instincts to flatter critics or executives, and less psychological need to reassure the mainstream that he was safe or grateful. He behaved, from relatively early on, as if mass culture had already missed its window to shape or contain him. That unapologetic confidence proved intoxicating to a younger, global, streaming native audience tired of overpolished, focus group pop stars. It was also deeply irritating to traditional critics and older audiences because it flipped the expected power dynamic. Instead of the artist proving they deserved the center was pressured to prove it could handle the artist on his terms. He skipped the traditional humble phase where stars act as if they need approval more than the system needs them. In its place, he projected the assumption that he was inevitable, and that resistance to him was the real problem. That early sound and attitude only amplified the challenge. Bad Bunny rose through Latin trap, a subgenre that entered broader American awareness not as polite multicultural exchange, but as something rawer, laced with darkness, material flexing, explicit lust, menace, a narcotic haze, and a bored, almost nihilistic insolence that resonated perfectly with fragmented, algorithm-fed attention spans. His vocal delivery often felt intentionally lazy or tossed off, as if straining for commercial appeal would be beneath him. This was seductive to fans who saw it as refreshing authenticity in a sea of try-hard performers. But it also carried an implicit challenge from the outset. He was not pleading for listeners to like him or find him charming. He was daring them to accept his centrality, whether they found him likable or not. Conventional stars build careers by inviting affection and identification. Bad Bunny's model demanded a form of submission or acquiescence. First, acknowledge my dominance, my language, my worldview before any affection could follow. For audiences already feeling culturally disoriented by rapid demographic and linguistic shifts, by the sense that familiar norms were being rewritten without their consent, this registered less as exciting novelty and more as a threat. He did not present as a harmless, colorful addition to the American pop landscape. He presented as an incoming force that expected the landscape to rearrange itself around his presence, his rhythms, and his priorities. Supporters labeled this authenticity and confidence. Detractors called it arrogance and presumption. Both reactions, however, stemmed from the same observable truth. He was constructing a career on raw presence and cultural pressure, rather than on earning permission through assimilation or broad reassurance. As commercial visibility exploded in the late 2010s, the music industry did what it always attempts with disruptive talents. It tried to absorb and domesticate him through collaborations, playlists, and crossover opportunities. His image became ubiquitous across streaming charts, fashion campaigns, and media coverage. Yet what set Bad Bunny apart, and what made him particularly grating to traditionalists, was that this mainstream expansion never seemed to demand or produce any genuine emotional or stylistic surrender on his part. He could collaborate with English-language stars or appear in bigger rooms without ever behaving like a grateful newcomer, finally allowed at the table. Instead, He often projected the sense that he was dragging his own cultural and linguistic room into those spaces, and forcing everyone else to adjust. For his core supporters, especially across Latin America and US, Latino communities, this was revolutionary, a Spanish-language artist achieving massive scale without the historical requirement of assimilation or dilution. For critics, the same phenomenon registered as a pointed rebuke to long-standing cultural hierarchies, the old implicit bargain that newcomers to the American mainstream would soften edges, code switch, reassure the dominant audience, and make themselves legible and non-threatening in familiar terms appeared broken or obsolete. Bad Bunny seemed to understand, perhaps earlier and more instinctively than many, that in the streaming age, a truly global mass audience could coalesce around shared identity, mood, rhythm, and grievance without needing approval from America's traditional cultural filters, gatekeepers, or sensibilities. Once that realization took hold, there was little incentive for the old humility or compromise. Defiance, refusal, and unapologetic otherness became not liabilities, but powerful marketing edges that differentiated him in a crowded field and deepened loyalty among his base. This is the juncture where Bad Bunny's story transitions from a commercial narrative into something broader and more politically charged. Even before his explicit political interventions, language itself acquires political weight when a figure dominates in a cultural form that much of the traditional American public had long regarded as marginal, foreign, or secondary. Every incremental increase in his success, while maintaining an almost entirely Spanish-language core, was not merely about selling streams or tickets. It represented the gradual dissolution of an older hierarchy of cultural centrality. To his fans, particularly younger generations, and diaspora communities, this felt like overdue justice and empowerment, a correction to historical marginalization. To others, it registered as a form of displacement, not always rooted in simple prejudice against the music or the Spanish language, but in the visceral sense that the emotional and symbolic bargain of American culture was changing unilaterally. The center no longer appeared to be confidently selecting and shaping what entered the mainstream on its own terms. It was increasingly forced to react to cultural products and figures already empowered elsewhere through global platforms. Bad Bunny's ascent made that loss of control visible and undeniable. He became living proof that a superstar could leverage American stages, American capital, and American attention without offering the symbolic gestures of gratitude, integration, or linguistic accommodation that earlier waves of immigrants and artists had often performed. He did not need to sound, look, or behave like old America to dominate segments of new America, and that reality combined with his cultivated aura of sovereign indifference turned him into a charged figure far beyond his discography. He was no longer simply an artist entertaining audiences. He had become an embodied argument about what kind of country, what kind of culture, and what kind of shared public square the United States was becoming in the streaming, post-consensus era. He represented a model of fame that felt less like genuine cultural integration or mutual enrichment, and more like cultural pressure, assertion, and one-way accommodation. A star who does not need to be welcomed can quickly begin to appear to those already uneasy about rapid change, like a star who does not particularly care whether the house still feels like home to its longtime occupants. By the end of the 2010s and into the early 2020s, Bad Bunny had transcended regional breakthrough status to become a genuine global force, and it was here that the complications and criticisms intensified rather than eased with success. Conventional celebrity arcs often involve a pivot toward safety as stakes rise, broader appeal, more careful image management, attempts at universal likability. Bad Bunny moved in the opposite direction with notable consistency. He seemed to intuit that his distinctive value lay not in sanding down abrasiveness, but in amplifying the unmistakable himself, even when that self radiated tension, annoyance, and a sense of superiority. His fashion grew louder, more experimental, and more deliberately provocative, frequently playing with gender norms in ways that invited both celebration and backlash. His body language stayed casually insolent, as if the world owed him space and attention without reciprocal effort. His facial expressions frequently projected a mix of half-amused detachment and underlying irritation, reinforcing the impression of someone performing sovereignty rather than seeking connection. He was not crafting the demeanor of a cultural unifier or bridge builder. He was constructing the aura of an untouchable cultural sovereign who viewed compromise as weakness. This posture had consequences for how controversies landed. When a more conventional, polished star airs or provokes, audiences often interpret it as a temporary lapse or human failing. When a figure with Bad Bunny's deliberately cultivated edge does the same, it reads as confirmation bias, in action the mask slipping to reveal what was always lurking beneath the branding. His image thus became a double-edged sword, powerfully distinctive and impossible to mistake for anyone else's. Yet it also made every subsequent display of arrogance, impulsiveness, or political aggression feel like the logical, almost predetermined next chapter in a consistent narrative, rather than an outlier or mistake requiring reflection. Politics did not arrive as an awkward add-on or opportunistic pivot. It functioned as a natural extension and amplification of the defiant identity he had been building. The devastation of Hurricane Maria in 2017 and the widely criticized federal response created a charged moral landscape that Puerto Rican artists could hardly ignore. And Bad Bunny did not. He publicly criticized the handling of aid, made his disdain for then-President Trump unmistakable, including sharp responses to the infamous paper towel toss, and later aligned himself with protests that contributed to the resignation of Governor Ricardo Rossello. Supporters framed these actions as authentic courage, and there is no denying that taking clear public stands carries risks for any celebrity. It is simpler and safer for stars to remain vague or apolitical. But this phase also taught Bad Bunny a lesson that proved both useful and dangerous for his brand. Political intensity, grievance, and moral positioning could dramatically amplify his reach and relevance. Every sharp statement delivered with contempt for established power deepened the authenticity halo around him. He evolved from a mere chart presence into a vessel for collective grievance, turning live shows and public appearances into something larger than entertainment. Concerts became communal affirmations of identity and correction for perceived historical disrespect. Buying the music or attending the show became an act of belonging to a cause or a mood, not just enjoying beats. Grievance is potent fuel in modern celebrity culture because it provides moral elevation and turns fandom into tribal membership. The downside is the blurring line between genuine conviction and calculated performance. Bad Bunny clearly cared about Puerto Rico's challenges, yet he also discovered that publicly staged anger enlarged his platform, deepened fan devotion, and generated endless media cycles. Once a star internalizes that dynamic, retreating toward neutrality or nuance becomes less appealing than doubling down on intensity. His explorations of gender and masculinity added another layer to this transformation, turning him into a cultural Rorschach test that different audiences projected wildly different meanings onto. He painted his nails, incorporated skirts or dresses into his looks, embraced fluid fashion choices, and spoke out against violence and rigid macho expectations in Puerto Rican and Latin culture. Admirers hailed this as bold progress and personal freedom in the face of toxic traditions. Critics saw a savvy performer who recognized how valuable sustained controversy could be in an attention economy that rewards transgression, especially when media institutions and progressive younger demographics equate boundary pushing with inherent virtue. It is entirely possible for both interpretations to hold partial truth simultaneously. A star can hold genuine beliefs while also understanding the career benefits of the resulting debates. In Bad Bunny's case, however, detractors increasingly viewed his approach as granting him an almost ironclad shield. Every gesture that unsettled traditional audiences simultaneously bolstered his standing among elite tastemakers and core fans. Objections could be reframed not as legitimate concerns about tone, proportion, or respect for shared spaces, but as evidence that he was bravely exposing societal rot. Discomfort became proof of his necessity. This feedback loop created a form of cultural immunity that allowed him to escalate abrasiveness with reduced risk of serious reputational damage. Earlier stars might have faced career-threatening boycotts or forced apologies for similar levels of provocation. Bad Bunny operated in an environment where the provocation itself often enhanced his mythos. He could afford to grow more uncompromising because the system's streaming metrics, media coverage, institutional bookings rewarded rather than punished the friction. The year 2020 and the period immediately following marked a noticeable inflection point, where Bad Bunny shifted from feeling like an excitingly expanding talent to an increasingly unavoidable and imposing cultural force. He appeared as a guest in the Super Bowl halftime show that year, alongside Shakira and Jennifer Lopez, already stepping into one of America's most symbolically loaded spectacles long before headlining it. Album momentum, award recognitions, and sheer visibility surged. Simultaneously, he leaned harder into using high-profile platforms for explicit social messaging, including spotlighting the murder of a transgender woman in Puerto Rico and other issues tied to identity and marginalization. Admirers portrayed this as the mark of a rare megastar who refused to compartmentalize morality from art, staying awake amid assent. Critics perceived something more calculated and disruptive, a celebrity who had decided that entertainment and ideological agitation must remain fused at every level, turning every major appearance into moral theater rather than simple performance. The issue was not the presence of compassion or social awareness. Few would argue against caring about violence or injustice. The problem was the compulsion, the sense that no stage was allowed to remain neutral or escapist. Audiences were no longer simply enjoying music or spectacle. They were being positioned, implicitly judged, and sorted into moral categories. Some viewers welcomed that fusion as meaningful progress. Others resented it as intrusive, exhausting, and ultimately disrespectful to the idea of shared entertainment, untethered from partisan or identity battles. This divide widened because 2020 also highlighted his role in proving that Spanish-language material could dominate Billboard charts and U.S. markets without apology or heavy translation. That achievement was artistically landmark. It was also culturally combustible in a polarized climate, adding another layer to the perception that he was not merely succeeding, but actively reshaping the terms of success in ways that challenged older assumptions about assimilation. The commercial and symbolic breakthrough of *El Último Tour del Mundo*, the first all-Spanish language album to hit No. 1 on the Billboard 200, crystallized these shifts in public perception. It was never just numbers on a chart. It represented a reversal of decades-old logic that had assumed full mainstream domination in the U.S., required English or significant linguistic accommodation. For fans, it was thrilling validation. For the industry, it signaled transformative possibilities for global Latin music. For critics already anxious about cultural fragmentation and the erosion of a coherent national center, it appeared as yet another data point, showing that traditional gatekeepers and sensibilities had lost decisive authority. Bad Bunny did little to soften the transition or make it feel consensual. He was not a smiling cultural translator, patiently explaining Latin traditions to English-speaking audiences in accessible terms. He presented as a proud, unapologetic carrier of his own language, his own sonic references, his own cultural memories, and increasingly, his own accumulated grievances. The implicit or explicit message seemed to be that if America, its platforms, and its audiences wanted access to his talent and scale, they would have to meet him largely on his terms rather than expecting reciprocal adaptation. This altered the emotional texture of his success. It felt less like warm welcome or organic integration, and more like forced recognition, achieved through leverage. A mainstream shaped by demographic pressure, streaming algorithms, and identity assertion carries a different valence than one built through consensus and mutual adjustment. It feels more contested, more zero-sum. Once Bad Bunny solidified as the living emblem of that contest, every subsequent major appearance in award ceremonies, sports-adjacent events, or national broadcasts carried an unavoidable ideological charge that went far beyond the music itself. His expansion beyond music into adjacent arenas only heightened the sense of overreach for skeptics. Participation in professional wrestling, particularly with WWE, was marketed as fun versatility, but it carried deeper symbolism. Wrestling is a distinctly American form of ritualized spectacle, loud, physical, theatrical, rooted in working and middle-class vernacular traditions of heroism, villainy, and larger-than-life storytelling. When Bad Bunny entered that world and achieved centrality, it signaled that his cultural reach was no longer confined by genre or origin. He could colonize multiple symbolically American spaces, simultaneously music charts, fashion weeks, gossip media, sports entertainment, and political discourse. That omnipresence delighted his devoted fans, who saw it as boundary-breaking genius. For others, it crossed a threshold from exciting ubiquity into something closer to inescapability. There comes a point when a public figure stops registering as a refreshing disruptor and starts feeling like an imposed constant in the cultural conversation. Once that shift occurs, isolated performances or statements are no longer judged on individual merit. They are evaluated against the cumulative weight of the persona. And the cumulative sensation Bad Bunny projected was one of relentless intensity, always online and responsive, always dressed or styled to provoke discussion, always positioned as the avatar of change or resistance, always adjacent to arguments about language dominance, gender norms, Puerto Rican status, immigration, or critiques of U.S. power. The more inescapable he became, the more some segments of the public began actively searching not merely for artistic flaws, but for evidence that the trademark confidence had curdled into self-importance, pettiness, or contempt for ordinary people. The larger the empire, the more satisfying it would feel to critics if the emperor could be caught in a moment of relatable human smallness or hypocrisy. That search for cracks was made easier by the fact that Bad Bunny's public persona had never centered warmth, relatability, or the old-fashioned celebrity promise of letting audiences feel they truly knew his heart. He could be magnetic in performance, visually inventive, stylish, and sensual on his own terms, but emotional warmth or broad generosity was never the primary offer. He sold edge, controlled distance, and an aura of superiority. Even in songs touching on romance or vulnerability, the overarching image retained a quality of hauteur, as if the audience was privileged to witness him rather than the reverse. He seemed to grasp that desire and fascination often intensify around figures who remain partially withheld or aloof. Yet distance carries hidden costs, especially as polarization deepens. Audiences can tolerate or even romanticize aloofness, while the star feels fresh and relatively unpolitical. Once the same figure becomes overtly polarizing, outspoken on divisive issues, and seemingly impatient with criticism or differing worldviews, that same distance hardens into something resembling disdain or contempt. Every cool or clipped public interaction gets reinterpreted as evidence of ego run amok. Every boundary enforcement begins to feel less like healthy self-protection and more like a reminder that the fans and ordinary people powering the streaming numbers, ticket sales, and cultural conversation are ultimately viewed as beneath the star's elevated station. Whether this reading is entirely fair is beside the point. Celebrities rise and fall on the emotional narratives audiences construct around them. Bad Bunny, for all his undeniable intelligence and strategic acumen, frequently seemed to court, or at least not discourage, the interpretations that would later erode goodwill among non-fans. He appeared to enjoy being a screen for projections. He thrived on pressure and heat. But when a figure becomes a repository for both intense admiration and accumulated public frustration, every misstep or perceived slight lands with amplified force, because segments of the audience were already primed to see confirmation of deeper character flaws. The 2023 phone incident served as a near-perfect condensation of these brewing anxieties into one viral, instantly interpretable image. Video captured a fan approaching Bad Bunny on the street while actively recording. He grabbed her phone and threw it away. Accounts vary on whether it landed in water or was simply discarded forcefully. He later addressed it on social media, explaining that he viewed shoving a phone in his face as a lack of respect, and that he would treat such behavior accordingly, while contrasting it with polite interactions, where he claimed he would always respond with attention and courtesy. Defenders rushed to his side with familiar modern arguments. Celebrities are human beings entitled to boundaries. Constant phone recording invades personal space in dehumanizing ways. Fame does not erase the right to basic dignity, and the epidemic of intrusive filming has eroded civil norms. All of these points contain truth in a broader cultural sense. Yet the visual carried disproportionate power, because it looked like more than a simple defense of personal space. It registered to many as a stark display of hierarchy and dominance. He was not merely declining or stepping away. He was reaching into someone else's moment, someone else's property, and asserting control in a humiliating fashion. The phone transformed from a consumer device into a prop in a miniature theater of power, and because it was captured on other cameras and spread globally, millions formed instant judgments about what it revealed. To critics, it confirmed long-simmering suspicions. Not merely a proud or self-protective star, but one increasingly comfortable leveraging his status to embarrass or punish ordinary people in public settings. The fan was not attacking him. She was attempting to capture a moment with a famous person in the age of ubiquitous recording. In response, he treated her property, and by extension her agency, as subordinate to his mood. For viewers already wary of celebrity entitlement, the clip was not a minor scandal. It felt like a revealing crack in the myth, exposing how the anti-establishment energy marketed upward could flip into something uglier when directed downward at regular individuals. What made the incident particularly corrosive was not solely the physical act, but the framing and tone of his follow-up explanation. He essentially moralized his irritation, transforming a moment of personal annoyance into a broader lesson about dignity and respect. In contemporary celebrity culture, this rhetorical maneuver has become common. Recast impulsive anger or power assertion as ethical defense of some higher principle. It allows famous figures to position themselves as victims of societal overreach, rather than agents of overreaction. In Bad Bunny's case, however, the approach backfired with skeptics because it lacked any noticeable regret or self-reflection. He sounded vindicated and certain that the public should align with his emotional hierarchy, rather than question it. Given the years he had spent building an image around refusal, defiance, and unfiltered realness, the response felt entirely consistent with the brand. Consistency, though, no longer looked admirable or refreshing to everyone. To growing critics, it looked like entrenched entitlement, the natural byproduct of a man who had grown so convinced of his own symbolic importance that he could no longer cleanly separate asserting basic humanity from asserting dominance over others. Defenders heard a superstar rightly insisting he was not public property or a selfie vending machine. Critics heard a multimillionaire icon who had just humiliated a fan, and then wrapped the action in self-serving moral language to avoid accountability. Once a strong visual image like that embeds in the collective memory, subsequent explanations rarely erase it. They usually become absorbed into it, reinforcing the original impression for those already inclined to see arrogance. The phone toss also illuminated a deeper contradiction at the heart of the Bad Bunny brand that critics had been pointing to for some time. He derived enormous cultural power from an image of raw authenticity, unfiltered, impulsive, uncoached, resistant to the usual celebrity polishing and PR management. Fans cherished the illusion that fame had not fully domesticated him or turned him into another bland, focus-grouped product, but authenticity is a double-edged sword that does not always flatter. At scale, being real can simply mean self-indulgence without the usual restraints that civilized public life demands. The incident forced an uncomfortable question. What does the celebrated force of rawness and defiance look like when it is no longer aimed symbolically at abstract systems or the establishment, but exercised directly against an ordinary person who got too close? What does anti-establishment swagger become when it manifests as literal dominance over a fan's personal property and moment? In that light, the phone incident was less a random aberration and more like an unintended stress test of the entire Bad Bunny project. The interpretation split cleanly along pre-existing lines. If you already viewed him as a refreshingly honest figure, suffocating under invasive modern attention, the event looked understandable, even if regrettable in execution. If you viewed him as a cultural sovereign who had begun treating the public and its norms as raw material for his myth-making and brand reinforcement, then the moment felt almost inevitable, a logical extension of the entitlement that had been building. Commercially, these controversies and the accumulating perceptions of arrogance did remarkably little to dent his momentum. In many ways, They seemed to fuel it. Streaming totals continued to climb into the stratosphere. His global reach expanded rather than contracted. By the end of 2025, Spotify declared him its most streamed artist worldwide for the fourth consecutive year, with an eye-popping 19.8 billion streams, while his album Asterisk de Bi Acute, Tai Rar Ma SFO, to S asterisk released January 5, 2025, topped the platform's global album chart. That project leaned heavily into Puerto Rican musical traditions plena, jibaro, salsa, bamba, blending them with his signature reggaeton, while touching on themes of love, heartbreak, partying, family, and the complexities of Puerto Rico's political status, including gentrification and cultural erosion. Numbers of that magnitude do more than validate taste. They reshape an artist's psychology and risk tolerance. They signal that objections from certain quarters are loud, but ultimately non-decisive. That controversy no longer exacts the same career costs it once did in a more unified media environment. And that's sufficiently large. Passionate audiences will continue rewarding the brand, even as the political and cultural temperature around it rises. Once a star internalizes that feedback loop, traditional caution begins to look not like wisdom, but like unnecessary self-sabotage. Why moderate tone or broaden appeal when heat and division convert so efficiently into streams, tickets, headlines, and cultural centrality? Why retreat into safer territory when every attack only reaffirms your relevance to your core? Why issue meaningful apologies when the metrics keep proving the machine is more resilient and more profitable than ever? This dynamic transformed Bad Bunny's personal story into something larger, an unflinching X-ray of how fame operates in the fragmented, algorithm-driven 21st century. In the older cultural order, major scandals or sustained public backlash could genuinely derail or significantly slow momentum, forcing course corrections. In the newer order, scandal and polarization often function as confirmation of centrality. Audiences are splintered, but intense loyalty within key fragments can generate outsized totals that outweigh diffuse disapproval. That system disproportionately rewards figures who already function as living symbols of larger societal arguments. Bad Bunny appeared to understand, whether through calculation or instinct, that being fought over was not a weakness. It was an engine for enlargement. Yet enormous commercial success does not resolve or erase the underlying moral and cultural questions. If anything, scale makes them sharper and more urgent. A figure operating at Bad Bunny's level of visibility and influence possesses more latitude than almost any previous generation of stars to consciously choose his posture toward the public and the society that elevated him. He can opt for expansive connection, careful proportion, and attempts at bridging divides. Or he can lean into contemptuous intensity, impulsive displays of power, and satisfaction with passionate but factional devotion. Increasingly, his choices appeared to favor the latter path. Not because he lacked the capacity for broader appeal, he clearly commanded it in raw numbers, but because identity-driven defiance and the aura of representing something bigger had become the more potent, sustaining sources of his power. That shift fundamentally altered the emotional contract between him and wider audiences. He no longer needed to make disparate groups feel equally seen or comfortable. In fact, deliberately making certain segments uncomfortable could intensify his value and loyalty among others who saw that discomfort as validation or justice. This is a heady, intoxicating position for any public figure to occupy. It converts conflict into evidence of one's own significance. It whispers that the star is not merely popular, but necessary, even prophetic. And once that sensation takes root, it becomes psychologically easier to dismiss criticism as ignorance or bad faith, caution as cowardice, and any call for compromise or restraint as a form of betrayal or assimilation. That internal logic helps explain why Bad Bunny continued pushing deeper into culture war terrain rather than dialing back as his profile, wealth, and influence grew. He had empirically learned that confrontation did not poison the brand. In many cases, it purified and strengthened it by clarifying who belonged to the inner circle of true fans versus the outsiders who didn't get it. The Puerto Rico-related political flashpoints reignited with fresh intensity during the 2024 election cycle, further cementing his role as a partisan lightning rod. after a comedian at a Trump rally crudely referred to Puerto Rico as a floating island of garbage. Bad Bunny used his massive Instagram platform, tens of millions of followers, to signal support for Kamala Harris. He shared clips of her addressing Puerto Rican voters, emphasizing her contrast with Trump's past handling of Hurricane Maria aid and framing the choice in stark moral terms. Supporters viewed this as a principled stand by a prominent son of the island, who could not remain silent in the face of perceived insult and historical neglect. Opponents saw a familiar and hardening pattern: a celebrity wielding enormous cultural reach to insert himself directly into electoral politics, implicitly instructing millions on what decency or loyalty required, and aligning himself unambiguously against one side of a bitterly divided national contest. For those already distrustful of concentrated power in entertainment elites, this crossed a meaningful line. Bad Bunny was no longer operating as a provocateur, confined to fashion statements or lyrical flexing. He had become an active, high-profile political actor, with the ability to influence discourse and voter sentiment at scale. That evolution matters because it retroactively colors every subsequent public appearance. Once a major star openly chooses sides in partisan conflict, audiences, especially those on the opposing side, stop experiencing his performances as neutral or escapist entertainment. Everything becomes potentially encoded with political meaning. Lyrics, visuals, language choices, gestures, even the decision to perform primarily in Spanish on a national stage, can be read as extensions of the larger fight over national identity, territorial status, immigration, and cultural power. In that context, the path toward the 2026 Super Bowl controversy was not accidental. It was the logical culmination of years of positioning that made a neutral or unifying appearance increasingly unlikely. His activism extended into territory many American conservatives found particularly inflammatory: direct criticism of immigration enforcement. At the 2026 Grammy Awards, during an acceptance speech, Bad Bunny declared ICE out criticizing U.S. immigration and customs enforcement, and adding statements emphasizing humanity over legal status. "We're not aliens, we are humans. And we are Americans." He had also reportedly adjusted tour routing to avoid certain mainland dates over concerns about federal agents targeting fans. Admirers interpreted these moves as humane bravery in the face of harsh policies. Critics saw an extraordinary level of disrespect: a superstar enjoying the full privileges and protections of American platforms, markets, and success, using one of entertainment's most prestigious stages to attack the country's laws and enforcement agencies at a moment when immigration sat at the absolute center of national debate. The framing mattered. He did not offer abstract, gentle humanitarian appeals that might allow room for differing policy views. He tended to moralize from a position of assumed ethical superiority, casting disagreement not merely as political difference, but as a failure of basic humanity. That rhetorical style energizes supporters who feel it validates their lived experiences. It simultaneously hardens opposition by suggesting that entire worldviews, those prioritizing enforcement, sovereignty, or rule of law, are beneath serious ethical consideration. Once critics internalize that they are being viewed through that lens, every future performance or appearance stops feeling like innocent entertainment and starts registering as another chapter in an ongoing challenge or provocation. The 2025 album ** de Biacute Tai Rar Ma Sfo to S** intensified these dynamics in the artistic realm while providing the commercial and thematic foundation for the Super Bowl appearance. Far from a standard release, it was positioned and received as a culturally assertive statement that placed Puerto Rico's identity, atmosphere, musical traditions, and lived complexities at the center of a global event, blending reggaeton with deeper dives into plena, gibero, salsa, and bamba. The project celebrated homeland while touching on themes that included the tensions of territorial status and cultural pressures like gentrification. It became Spotify's top global album of the year, reinforcing Bad Bunny's dominance. For fans, this represented collective elevation and pride, a superstar bringing the island's full richness to the world without compromise. For critics, it deepened the sense of grievance politics fused with entertainment. The more explicitly Puerto Rican and oppositional the framing grew, the easier it became for opponents to argue that he was no longer simply expressing love for his origins. He was transforming every major platform into an ongoing referendum on what America supposedly owed Puerto Rico, on historical failures, on whose language, pain, and narrative deserved primacy in shared spaces. There are certainly noble dimensions to exploring identity and injustice through art, but there is also a version that can feel, to viewers outside the coalition, like perpetual accusation dressed up as spectacle celebrity grievance that demands attention and accommodation while offering little in return by way of unifying warmth or acknowledgement of the host culture's legitimate attachments. Bad Bunny frequently operated right at that tense boundary, and his success suggested the system was more than willing to reward him for it. This was the heavily freighted context in which the NFL and its partners made the decision to hand him the Super Bowl halftime stage. From a purely demographic and attention economic standpoint, the choice was logical. He was one of the planet's biggest artists, with proven ability to drive global viewership and streams. The halftime show had long since evolved beyond pure musical performance into a broader statement about relevance, youth appeal, sponsorship synergy, and cultural signaling. In that calculus, Bad Bunny made strategic sense, from a different, more traditionalist angle. However, the booking felt almost provocatively tone-deaf, or even designed to court division. Here was an artist who had spent years antagonizing significant portions of the American public through political statements, who had backed Harris in pointed terms after the Puerto Rico rally remarks, who had used award stages to criticize federal immigration authorities, who had altered tour plans over enforcement fears, and who had built his brand around a refusal to soften, translate, reassure, or prioritize broad national unity. Assigning him the center of the Super Bowl was not equivalent to booking a superstar with mild or private opinions. It was closer to placing a lit fuse at the heart of a national ritual already strained by polarization. Some voices pushed back pre-show, arguing for a more conventionally American or unifying act. Others dismissed concerns as reactionary panic in the face of inevitable demographic and cultural evolution. But the underlying recognition was widespread. This event was unlikely to function as neutral entertainment. Large segments of the audience would inevitably watch it through a political or symbolic lens first, with the music secondary. And Bad Bunny, more than perhaps any other contemporary artist, had mastered the art of converting that exact tension into personal and cultural momentum. When the performance unfolded, it largely fulfilled the expectations and fears of both camps. Bad Bunny did not neutralize his persona for the occasion. He did not adopt a broadly sanitizing or conciliatory tone designed to reassure nervous viewers. He did not overcompensate by incorporating more English, more familiar American pop tropes, or gestures of explicit national unity. Instead, he delivered an unmistakable, vibrant celebration of Latino and specifically Puerto Rican culture, delivered predominantly in Spanish, complete with theatrical sets that evoked island life in rich, unapologetic detail. To many in Hispanic communities, particularly those feeling cultural or political pressure, the moment registered as powerful recognition and affirmation on one of the world's largest stages. But that very affirmation produced the inverse reaction in others. Where one audience experienced inclusion and pride, another experienced exclusion and a subtle sense of displacement from what they had considered a shared national space. Where one saw joyful representation, another saw scolding or assertion. Where one heard cultural pride, another heard a declaration that the cultural center no longer felt obligated to speak in registers or symbols they readily understood or identified with. This double effect was not accidental to Bad Bunny's career. It had become one of its defining outcomes. He had spent years honing the ability to generate polarized reactions more potently than almost any peer, making one group feel profoundly seen, while another felt pushed aside. Whether that was always his explicit, conscious goal, or simply the emergent result of his choices, it proved extraordinarily effective at sustaining relevance. And when that dynamic played out on the Super Bowl stage, a massive national backlash was all but guaranteed. The event did not create the underlying cultural tensions. It exposed and amplified them in high definition. Trump's post-show response served as the blunt instrument that crystallized months or years of accumulated frustration. His characterization of the performance as terrible, one of the worst ever, an affront to American greatness, and a literal slap in the face, was characteristically maximalist. He highlighted the language barrier, nobody understands a word, the style of dancing, and the overall sense that the show had prioritized one identity over any attempt at national cohesion. Conservative commentary and alternative events like the Turning Point USA production amplified the critique, framing the original show as emblematic of elite cultural capture. While some elements were clearly performative politics, the resonance stemmed from a genuine sentiment that extended beyond any single politician or organization. Large numbers of viewers felt that a cherished national broadcast moment had been repurposed in ways that no longer even attempted to include or flatter their sensibilities. They sensed that institutions once expected to foster unity were now comfortable alienating significant portions of the audience in service of demographic targeting or progressive signaling. Bad Bunny had not invented this broader trend, but his career choices and persona made him its most visible, successful, and therefore infuriating exemplar. He was too dominant to ignore, too embedded in elite institutions to dismiss as fringe, and too consistently defiant to allow easy neutralization through criticism or calls for balance. Looking at the full arc with a critical lens reveals a consistent through line that resists simple inspirational framing. The trajectory moves from local church choir participant to bedroom SoundCloud experimenter, from grocery store worker to breakout trap artist rejecting polish, from streaming dominator who bypassed traditional gatekeepers to chart topper refusing linguistic or stylistic assimilation, from regional voice to global political celebrity, channeling Puerto Rican and broader grievances, from fashion provocateur to omnipresent icon comfortable inserting himself across domains, from phone-throwing celebrity defending respect on his terms to Grammy stage critic of federal agencies, and finally to Super Bowl headliner who transformed a unifying American spectacle into a platform centered on his uncompromised identity and worldview. Each step represented not dilution by success, but further sharpening and escalation. Whenever external pressures or expectations suggested a natural broadening toward safer, more universally appealing stardom, he responded by becoming more pointed, more symbolically loaded, and more willing to test the audience's tolerance for his terms. This pattern explains both his enormous appeal to fans who see him as authentically uncompromising, and the enduring criticism from those who view the same choices as evidence of growing arrogance and disregard for shared norms. Critics often locate the core issue, not primarily in the quality of his art. Many acknowledge genuine talent, sonic innovation, and cultural impact, but in the posture and attitude that surround it. Plenty of public figures hold strong or controversial positions on issues while maintaining a sense of proportion, self-deprecating humor, generosity toward opponents, or at least a willingness to acknowledge why others might feel uneasy. Bad Bunny has frequently appeared uninterested in or incapable of that kind of broad-minded engagement. He projects less like a bridge seeking mutual understanding and more like an unstoppable cultural force demanding acceptance on his own uncompromising terms. Even his moments of charm or playfulness tend to exist within a larger framework of challenge and assertion. He rarely seems motivated to reassure those outside his coalition that he grasps or respects their perspectives, their attachments to older cultural forms, or their sense of loss amid rapid change. Instead, he often appears to relish the discomfort or treat it as further proof of his disruptive necessity. This can read as courageous conviction if one believes the discomfort is justified and overdue. It can equally read as immature or adolescent arrogance if one believes a figure of his stature and privilege bears some responsibility to distinguish between legitimate self-assertion and deliberate, unnecessary provocation that fractures the public square. In many ways, the sustained moral case against Bad Bunny distills to this tension. Is he a principled artist, courageously refusing to shrink himself for a society uncomfortable with change and difference? Or is he a profoundly talented and strategically brilliant celebrity who has learned that antagonizing large segments of that society is one of the most reliable ways to deepen his intensify fan loyalty, and maintain cultural heat. The most realistic assessment may be that elements of both are true, but it is the second dimension, the calculated, or at least conveniently self-reinforcing embrace of division, that gives his critics their most enduring and potent ammunition. He does not merely stumble into controversy or polarization as an unfortunate side effect of authenticity. He often seems to court and cultivate it as evidence of his own importance and the backwardness of those who resist. Compounding the critique is the way broader changes in celebrity culture have created an environment almost perfectly optimized for a figure like Bad Bunny. In earlier eras, stars generally needed some degree of universal, or at least cross-demographic approval, to sustain mega success. Today, in a fragmented media landscape, the premium is on intensity, identity-rich devotion, and audiences that treat fandom as an extension of tribal worldview, community belonging, or active correction of perceived historical wrongs. Within that ecosystem, Bad Bunny's brand is engineered for dominance. He can absorb and even thrive on criticism because it reinforces the narrative that he matters enough to be opposed. He can alienate wide swaths of the public and compensate with deeper loyalty from his core. He can take explicit political or cultural positions without needing to perform neutrality or balance. He can transform incidents that might have damaged more conventional, consensus-oriented stars into new legendary chapters that affirm his realness. None of this excuses specific behaviors or absolves him of responsibility for the divisiveness he helps generate. But it does explain with clinical clarity why the Bad Bunny phenomenon has continued expanding despite, or often directly, because of backlash. The older ideal of celebrity emphasized broad consensus and likability across lines. The emerging ideal rewards centrality within conflict, the ability to serve as a focal point for societal arguments. By that metric, he has proven nearly unbeatable. He is not simply famous in the traditional sense. He has become a living site of cultural argument, a shorthand for debates about how fast and in what direction American identity, language, demographics, and public rituals are shifting. The Super Bowl did not invent or assign him that role. It merely broadcast, in spectacular fashion, how thoroughly he had embraced and perfected it. The sharper critical reading of his life and impact is ultimately more unsettling than superficial dismissals that label him overrated, vulgar, or musically deficient. Those attacks miss the substance. The more rigorous critique acknowledges that Bad Bunny is genuinely gifted, sonically innovative, and historically significant in demonstrating the power of non-English, globally oriented stardom in the streaming age. At the same time, it argues that he has deployed those gifts in ways that exemplify some of the least attractive temptations of modern celebrity and cultural power. He has fused artistic talent with grievance politics so seamlessly that almost any criticism can be reframed as oppression, intolerance, or failure to evolve. He has fused cultural pride with provocation so tightly that objections risk being cast as rooted in bigotry rather than legitimate concerns about tone, proportion, or respect for pluralistic spaces. He has fused the marketing of authenticity with personal impulsiveness so completely that calls for basic public restraint or courtesy can be dismissed as demands for inauthenticity or selling out. He has fused ideological messaging with personal brand so effectively that major institutions' labels, sponsors, leagues, awards shows continue rewarding the agitation rather than applying any meaningful pushback or expectation of balance. In short, he is not a hollow fraud writing hype. He is something more difficult to dismiss or easily categorize, a real artist of considerable ability, whose extraordinary power has grown in tandem with an image of increasing moral self-certainty and decreasing interest in public humility, reciprocity, or generosity toward those outside his coalition. That combination is especially volatile because it resists straightforward correction or accountability. Fans defend him fiercely, as necessary and authentic. Institutions reward him as culturally relevant and commercially indispensable. Opponents' attacks frequently backfire by making him appear even more sympathetic or embattled to his supporters. The feedback loop tightens. He grows larger and more central. Each new controversy becomes less a potential course correction and more another affirmation of his chosen path. One can reasonably ask whether Bad Bunny could have charted a meaningfully different course as a superstar, while still achieving massive success and bringing Puerto Rican culture, Spanish-language music, and distinct identity to global prominence. The answer is almost certainly yes. There exists a plausible alternate version of his story in which he still centers his heritage and refuses full assimilation, but does so with greater interest in broadening the room rather than repeatedly testing who feels unwelcome or displaced within it. A version where he asserts personal boundaries without publicly humiliating fans or framing ordinary interactions as profound disrespect. A version where he engages political and social issues with seriousness and passion, but without routinely casting large segments of the country or traditional viewpoints as morally bankrupt or beneath contempt. A version where his use of quintessentially American platforms and institutions feels more like expansive mutual enrichment and less like symbolic retaliation or conquest. Those alternate paths would have demanded different personal and professional instincts, more patience with criticism, more restraint in moments of irritation, more deliberate effort at persuasion across divides rather than reliance on defiance, and a stronger instinct for cultivating common ground instead of standing triumphantly atop the rubble of eroded older expectations. The Bad Bunny, who actually rose to dominance, appeared to consciously or temperamentally select the hotter, more frictional route. He chose sustained heat over cooling consensus. He chose productive friction over reconciliation. He chose a model of fame that treats controversy, polarization, and accusations of overreach less as hazards to be managed, and more as proof of his disruptive force and relevance. That strategic or instinctive choice made him culturally gigantic on a scale few artists achieve. It also rendered him, for millions of Americans outside his fervent base, the clearest living embodiment of a newer, more confrontational style of celebrity, one that no longer feels obligated to extend even minimal courtesy, humility, or acknowledgement to the broader public, if doing so would dilute symbolic power or identity coherence. The single most revealing aspect of his entire career may be the simple fact that he never appeared particularly interested in becoming universally lovable or broadly reassuring in the manner of many previous crossover icons. Plenty of stars pay lip service to wanting mass appeal and unity. Few achieve it consistently, and even fewer maintain it amid polarization. Bad Bunny often seemed too strategically astute or too temperamentally committed to waste energy, chasing an ideal that the fragmented culture no longer rewarded as highly as intensity and tribal devotion. He read the room of his era accurately, a splintered attention economy where argument itself keeps a figure central, where identity provides deeper stickiness than vague universality, and where millions will love you more passionately precisely because millions of others feel unsettled, challenged, or displaced by what you represent. He understood that, in such an environment, there is enormous sustained value in becoming the person everyone is forced to argue about, because perpetual argument prevents fading into irrelevance. That insight helps explain why his biography refuses reduction to a simple inspirational climb from barrio to global icon. It is better understood as a biography of calculated or instinctive escalation, of learning how to alchemize personal and collective identity, irritation, anger, and cultural tension into scalable market power, while preserving the appearance of spontaneity and raw honesty. It is the story of someone who skillfully leveraged the unique vulnerabilities and contradictions of Puerto Rico's status, the shifting language politics of a diversifying United States, the vanity and trend chasing of the entertainment industry, and the emotional economics of digital fandom to construct a persona so large and polarizing that even sitting presidents felt compelled to respond to it directly. That achievement is extraordinary by any measure of cultural influence. It is also deeply polarizing and, for many, symptomatic of unhealthy trends in how fame, power, and public discourse now function. After the initial outrage, the endless social media storms, the dueling headlines, the fan defenses, the political spin, the anti-ICE rhetoric, the phone-throwing moment, the halftime firestorm, and the ongoing arguments over language, respect, belonging, and whose comfort matters in national rituals, what ultimately remains is a figure who reveals as much about the contradictions and fractures of the current age as he does about his individual talent or choices. Bad Bunny is what emerges when substantial artistic talent collides with potent grievance at precisely the right technological and demographic moment. He is what happens when a child of a semi-belonging, semi-outsider U.S. territory realizes he can exploit the center's platforms, capital, and attention without ever needing to emotionally or symbolically belong to it or flatter its traditional self-image. He is what happens when celebrity culture learns that carefully calibrated offense, refusal, and identity assertion can be monetized and scaled more efficiently than old-fashioned reassurance or consensus building. He is what happens when fashion, partisan politics, music, territorial pride, and symbolic warfare collapse into a single, self-reinforcing personal brand. And he is what happens when large audiences decide consciously, or through algorithmic reinforcement, that questioning or criticizing the star is tantamount to questioning the validity of everything he appears to represent. Demographic change, linguistic shift, resistance to traditional norms, and the redefinition of shared public space. That is why reactions to him so often feel overheated and existential, rather than merely aesthetic. People are not arguing solely about song quality, dance moves, or stage production. They are arguing, through him, about deeper questions of national identity, the pace and character of demographic and cultural transformation, the legitimacy of competing claims on public rituals, the role of immigration and territorial status, the future of masculinity and gender expression, the dominance of English as a unifying language, the influence of elite institutions, and whether the American public square still belongs in any meaningful sense to everyone or has become the province, primarily of those fluent in the newest codes of power, identity, and grievance. In that larger contest, Bad Bunny is not a neutral participant or innocent bystander. He has chosen a side, a style, a language, and a tone with remarkable consistency. That is his prerogative as an artist and public figure, but it is also exactly why his critics feel justified in describing him not merely as controversial or edgy, but as actively disrespectful to large segments of the audience and the country whose platforms he has so successfully used. They believe he has leveraged some of the biggest stages America offers not simply to perform or celebrate, but to signal, sometimes explicitly, often implicitly, that the comfort, traditions, and expectations of the old audience no longer carry meaningful weight if they conflict with his symbolic project. And that, stripped of spin from all directions, is the real substance behind the intense outrage surrounding his Super Bowl performance and the broader career it capped. Not the claim that Bad Bunny lacks talent, he clearly possesses it in abundance. Not the idea that he rose purely by accident or hype. He methodically built his empire through savvy navigation of new technologies and cultural shifts. Not even the notion that he is uniquely monstrous or offensive in a celebrity landscape, already saturated with vanity, narcissism, and performative politics. The sharper, more enduring story is that he identified the tensions, fractures, and opportunities of his historical moment, and turned them into a highly effective personal operating system. He mastered the conversion of refusal into glamour, grievance into rhythm and brand cohesion, identity into globally scalable product, and controversy into hardened loyalty and institutional rewards. He demonstrated that major American institutions, sports leagues, awards bodies, streaming services, fashion houses would continue platforming and profiting from him, even when substantial portions of the American public felt openly antagonized, displaced, or disrespected by the tone, content, and symbolism of what he delivered. That reality is why the Super Bowl backlash registered not as an isolated overreaction, but as the long-delayed culmination of a trajectory that had been building for years. Bad Bunny did not drift passively into the role of cultural lightning rod. He actively built it, reinforced it at every turn, defended it against softening influences, and reaped enormous benefits from it. Whether future histories will remember him primarily as a revolutionary artist who expanded cultural boundaries, a brilliant opportunist who rode demographic and technological waves to unprecedented heights, a liberator who gave voice to marginalized identities on the global stage, or a potent symbol of late-stage celebrity arrogance and institutional capture, will depend on who controls the narrative in the decades ahead. But the clearest, least comforting truth available right now may be the simplest. Bad Bunny did not become as controversial as he did because audiences suddenly failed to understand or appreciate his genius. He became controversial and remained so at the highest levels of visibility because he repeatedly and deliberately chose the more divisive road at every fork. The road where controversy reliably multiplied his power, deepened his myth, and enlarged his influence. By the time the entire country was compelled to confront him on its most watched annual stage, the music, the message, the entitlement, and the challenge had become impossible to separate. The performance was not an aberration. It was the logical, predictable, and in many ways, intended destination of the path he had been walking, refining, and profiting from for over a decade.